Good afternoon. It's Wednesday and it is 12:15 and it is our other programme, The Unearthing. And today we have got an extremely interesting looking subject, which of course I have not put the correct title on at all. I'm so sorry. Let me find the right title because of course we want to talk about the subject. Where's it gone? Here we go.
Because we were
This is
going through the run through.
Horse in the act.
It's okay.
So today we're going to be talking about avoidance and restrictive intake of food. And Sue, as ever, has been incredibly busy. So I'm going to hand over to Sue. Sue.
Thank you. Yes. So this was something that came to my attention again in my studying, and is a fascinating subject for me. And I recently saw an article on the BBC about a child who got this diagnosis of avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder. And that was the first time I'd heard of it. And I thought, oh, what's that? So that took me down the rabbit hole of eating disorders. And there is a difference with disorder or not. And there are still significant commonalities and elements of avoidant and restrictive food intake with autistic people. And there is, a lot of overlap. And no surprise that there are anxiety difficulties and sensory difficulties, and it's all intertwined. So I did an immediate Google of,
as you do,
as I do, of what is the acronym. And it said on one particular website, it's when eating a range of foods becomes much less normal, in inverted commas, than a healthy amount. There might well be signs of struggling to eat. The young person or adult may miss out meals, may have picky eater as a label attached to them, may have difficulty feeling hungry, recognizing hunger, may eat the same meals with frequency, and it might well be a real challenge to have a family meal as well. So those are signs of ARIF, if you want to call it that. And when I looked further into what qualifies as the disorder, obviously that is an extreme version of that, to the point where the limitations placed on the range of foods becomes a really significant problem in terms of the person might lose weight, become malnutritioned. That's not a word.
Malnourished.
Malnourished. Oh, that's funny. Malnutritioned. That's a mistake now. Sorry.
There's an autistic word.
My attention differences now have just gone off. That's an autistic word, definitely. Yeah, so where was I? I've just lost my track.
Malnourished.
Yes, and significantly less nutrients obviously being taken in. And this also might lead to total sort of distress anytime a meal occurs, and massive amounts of anxiety. And Beat, which is the charity that deals with eating disorders, does say that there are different reasons on this website, and some of them can be to do with sensitivities. Some could be because they've had a bad experience around food. Perhaps when they were really little, in early infancy, there was physical symptoms of reflux. Perhaps they could not digest milk properly. Maybe there's a sensitivity to milk which led to real stress as a baby and having milk.
Yeah.
So there are links to early childhood symptoms around food, more often than not, I think, and also the autism diagnosis. There have been a lot of commonalities with that. I just found.
So why 2013 then? What's the link with that? Is that when it became identified, or?
Yeah, so the DSM, the manual for diagnostics, which is referred to by the professionals, the medical professionals, that is when ARIF became a disorder, an official condition, because a lot of us know and are aware of anorexia nervosa, bulimia, binging and purging. They are much more common eating disorders. On the Beat website, it said that there well could be signs of issues around food, and certainly social food gatherings, that there might be withdrawal, tiredness, emotional difficulties around food, difficulty with self-esteem, being very painfully self-conscious of eating in front of others. And this could lead to secretive eating at home. So, but that is just something that's other than specified, that if there's parents out there thinking, has my child got the avoidant restrictive food disorder or not, then I certainly recommend looking on that website, Beat website, because it breaks it all down of the different types, and it did help me sort of think, there is overlap obviously with some of these eating disorders, and anorexia, of course, is perhaps more commonly known than most, and that is when there is strict calorie counting and perhaps body dysmorphia, where the young person believes that they're overweight and do absolutely everything they can to lose weight, and that is a distinct difference to ARIF.
Okay.
In that, it's not about body image, it's not about losing weight. This is something that is anxiety driven more often than not, and probably sensory driven as well. So different reasons.
I was just thinking of my youngest daughter, who did have a fairly restricted diet, shall we call it the beige diet. But there were certain things that induced vomiting, and there was something about the vomiting that she could not handle, very, very distressed. So those foods were immediately binned because of that horrible anxiety around I might throw up. And there is a real discomfort amongst a lot of my clients who don't like vomiting. So there's something in there, isn't there, about the sensories, the I know we'll cover that a bit more, but just having that aspect of understanding as well, isn't it?
There is a whole raft of reasons why this food intake might be massively reduced. It's not a straightforward, clear-cut picture.
When is autism ever clear-cut? I'm just really beginning to understand so much more.
I know, and also the fact that there's been more study into those anorexics as well. Those young people finding themselves having to be put into some sort of hospital, to deal with it, where their weight has been gone so dramatically that they have to have an intervention. And they are finding that there are autistic people in that cohort, you know, of anorexia. And so I think there has been more interest in it, and certainly the link with autism and OCD as well. You know, some people think that because OCD is extreme manifestation of anxiety and control of it by, you know, ritualizing and having routine and being fixated, that, you know, there's overlap there with autism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose if it's, you know, I very briefly worked as a clinician within anorexia. It is not my field at all. So for me, it was great to have the experience, but something I kind of bowed out of. I find with that is that once it's that level of diagnosis, it's almost too late, isn't it? Because you haven't been able to have a fighting chance of understanding whether there were any other issues. So you're not only dealing, you know, if you're autistic and you've been identified, you know, a bit like anxiety or depression, you've been diagnosed with those first, and then afterwards they find that you're autistic. It's kind of too late. You then have to do so much work, don't you, to unpick all of that to get back to that starting point.
Well,
but I digress. I'm sorry.
It did say it did say in one article that understanding autism and the relationship of that, and whether there's a diagnosis or not, or, you know, pursue it certainly, and that in the eating disorder population, this is that it may help to decipher those that have a poor response to treatment, because it tends to be something that is so tricky to manage in the medical world. You know, it's such a long-term investment and so traumatic, because the young person can't be at home more often than not when it's so extreme. You know, they have to be in one of these hospitals that are very specifically for that, and it's sort of about the psychological element, you know, at that point. And it is a mental illness. You know, these eating disorders are now known to be mental illnesses. And 20% of those that have the anorexia diagnosis are autistic. This is an estimate. So it's no small number, you know, it's significant.
Now, you've been very busy. I didn't have any part to play in this, did I? Tell the truth now, did I? Suddenly it was up and running and I was like, oh, this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, I thought
you did a poll.
Yeah, and I'm so delighted with the response that we got.
Staggering.
Really delighted, and I've had so much reassurance that this is a necessary topic to discuss, because, you know, it affects so many of our families. And 73 of you shared that the sensory input around food, as in, you know, having overload, perhaps very heightened sense of smell or taste, that really impacts the young person. And 59 parents reported their young people having a restricted variety of food.
Right.
And 56 signs of anxiety around food. And another significant number is 45 parents reported that their young people will refuse foods if not perceived to be their normal. And this could be even down to brands, and this is something I've seen reported a lot on different autism communities online, for example, that, you know, if when lockdown hit, for example, there was one parent who said, oh goodness, we can't get to McDonald's because my child only ever eats McDonald's fries, no other fries will do. And I mean, I can relate because one of mine had a very particular brand of tuna fish, interestingly. And
Yeah.
so obviously tuna fish can come in oil, water, brine.
Yeah.
But no, not my son. It had to come in the sun-dried tomato variety in a sachet, which is not cheap. And if I couldn't get it, other tuna fish just wouldn't cut it. So that's interesting, and I'm sure lots of parents can share about that. But if it isn't in their remit, you know, even sometimes it could be that you present the meal and the young person might consider it and look at it and say, no, not eating that.
Yeah.
And so you find out why, and it might be that there's something on the plate that is really disturbing them to the point where they can't look at it.
Yeah.
I have included in the poll about you know, if there's strict rituals and guidelines, you know, for how a meal happens, and or how that person might want to eat their meal, for example. And that's all connected as well in terms of, you know, it's about the routine. It's about the need for familiarity, the need for safety.
Yes.
Because the senses, certainly, you know, 73 families saying that sensory input is key to this, that, you know, there might be something in that, you know, it's not just about refusal, which is, you know, this correlates to school refusal, doesn't it? Again, that, you know, this word refusal, that, you know, what really is that about? It's so much more than the word, and so much more about lack of control than actual difficultness, you know.
Yeah. So again, I was just thinking about some of our clients have fed back to us that they struggle in, say, for example, the canteen, when we think about foods and the smells, and they can't partake, shall we say, in that particular activity, but also because there is that horrible sensory issue around noise, there is too many people, there's a sensory issue around smells, and it's kind of overloading. Did you, by any interest, kind of see if there was a bigger margin of people, either primary age or secondary age? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, so it was certainly affecting more of our teenagers.
Yeah.
So I got 50 for those aged between 11 and 18,
Right.
and under 20 for those between the ages of 2 and 10. I think that's not really surprising, because if we understand teenagers, you know, they tend to want to assert themselves. They tend to want to break free from parental control and restraints, and make their own decisions about what they're going to eat, when they're going to eat it. So there's an awful lot more of that going on. And that's all typical of a teenage person. Also, what I found really interesting is that 50 parents reported that it was their sons that had this challenge with food intake, as opposed to 25 females. And so that's double. And you know, I had this complete misconception that eating disorders was much more of a bigger issue in the female portion of our population, but not according to the M-word community. And is that not fascinating? And is that possibly because of this classic, you know, autism diagnosis difficulty in females, you know, getting our daughters diagnosed? Is that because males, boys, are more likely to mask their issues because of stigma around food issues? I think it is incredibly stigmatizing for anyone, but especially for young men, very vulnerable young men. And I think in looking at the programs that I have on in the past on documentaries done about anorexia, for example, that there aren't as many young men in these clinics as females. And I think that is all tied in with the negative misunderstandings, because, you know, we're all human beings and we all require food and we all have our systems and ways of doing things. But I think for a young person, a young man, to admit to having problems with food is such a massive thing. And our parents are in the, you know, the front line and are seeing this. And I'm sure lots of our young men, you know, they really feel that perhaps restricting their food or avoiding their food is some sort of way of controlling their anxiety. You know, if autism is at play, then it has to sort of show itself somehow. It presents itself somehow. And eating is something we do all the time. And so it's a very obvious way of showing that anxiety, I guess.
Goodness me. I mean, it's most impressive, isn't it, that we've had so many parents just so willing to kind of respond, because it all helps, doesn't it, in giving a bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, meal times are such a can be such a high point of the day, a focus of the day. It can be a time to be properly together as a family, and when there's disruption to that, it's incredibly stressful. And I think that's why perhaps this poll has reached out to so many, is that, you know, if there is one of their young people refusing to eat, or perhaps having a meltdown about something, or perhaps unable to join the table, unable to get involved in food prep, you know, or indeed the extreme of being physically sick, gagging, choking, retching, you know, it's incredibly distressing to see.
Yeah. Is this a good time to go on to the bombardment of senses? Because sensory is very much a predominant part of autism, isn't it? So when we're thinking about food, I guess we're thinking about all senses, aren't we?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was thinking about this the other day, processing it all on my walk, which is always a highlight for me, you know, I've got all this information going around in my head, and I just thought, you know, the meal time is an absolute bombardment, because food is everything, you know, sensory wise. It is taste, it is smell, it is texture, it is colour, it is the social aspect as well. So it's everything. It's visual, it's everything. And no surprise that, you know, sensory perception is a huge part of autism theory and has been debated for so long. And I bought a book a long time ago because of my noticing my young people, both my young people having challenges, shall I say, around food. And other things, you know, like my youngest, for example, I thought at one point he had pica, P-I-C-A, which is when people eat inedible non-foods. Because when he was little, I often found him with pen lids, straws, Lego, stones, you name it, in his mouth. And so that was just like, what on earth is going on here? And that's when I learned about pica from this book. So this has been a really useful book for this topic. And it's done by Olga Bogdashina. I love her name. And it's about different sensory experiences, different perceptual worlds. And this was produced in 2016. And I've got some quotes from it. in the last decade, there has been an explosion of interest in research around the impact of sensory perception difficulties, not only on behaviours, but also on cognition, language acquisition, social communication, and development of autistic individuals. And she said there's been an oversimplification of this, in that sensory problems are called hypersensitivities. There's so much more to it than that. And that if there are sensory differences in our young people at a very early age that we observe and notice as parents, then that is truly a sign of autism. Back in the 70s, there were people looking into the sensory aspects of autism. And Delicato is one, 1974, and he observed that autism affected one or more sensory channels, making brains of autistic children perceive inputs from the outside world differently to non-autistic brains. And that unusual sensory experiences were in fact a primary characteristic of autism, and that it should be considered essential to diagnostic classifications. And this was back in 1974. And did it appear in the DSM as one of the factors of autism essential to diagnosis? No. It became completely sidelined despite all this evidence.
So exactly the same way as PDA then, very sidelined. It's strange, isn't it? It's so strange.
Yeah, it's only been in this last decade that, you know, there are people out there, psychologists and psychiatrists and pediatricians, very aware of the sensory abnormalities, for want of a better word, but, you know, that's how they're classified, isn't it, in the medical world, is that, you know, anything different from the norm. And I mean, what we've found out, of course, through all these wonderful autistic adults who were once children, of course, back in the 70s, me being one of them, but, you know, it's not like I'm about to produce a book or anything yet, that, you know, there have been so many issues around food from a very young age if autism is at play.
Wow. Okay. So what would you like to tell me about this? This sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so I got slightly off on a tangent.
Did you? Can't think why.
I know, it's not surprising at all, really. From
easily distracted.
The sensory element obviously is huge and a big factor, but also the influence of autism. And you know, what I've learned these last few years, that it's not straightforward, it's not cut and dry, and there's so many theories. And one of the theories that has really now caught on and is being talked about a lot is monotropism.
Oh, okay.
Big word. But this was a theory proposed by Dinah Murray. And this was a while back now, that she recognized in her work with autistic people that there is a tunnel-like attention, and it can also be called hyper focus, where, you know, one person might be so well focused on one thing that it is to the absolute exclusion of everything else in the environment. And so this could account for, with eating, for example, with food, as in that, you know, one meal is preferred. that also, you know, a young person might be compelled to eat one type of food, because it is about minimizing the input. That, you know, there is so much input, so much that needs to be filtered out by the brain. The autistic brain struggles with that. And I read a really fantastic quote, which is the autistic brain is like a sieve that effectively it can't filter out. That there is this total deficit, again, for want of a better word, but of gating. So if you think of like the brain as like the part of the brain that deals with sensory input as like a gatekeeper, that there is this lack of filtering out. And so we become monotropic in order to get things done, you know, otherwise who would cope with eating a meal if there's all this information coming at you that cannot be sort of closed off in order for you to eat your meal?
I find this quite interesting because I'm just thinking, I did an assessment last week and I had a young person and the parent explained to me that the cereal of choice was the same for breakfast, but had been for something like 5 years, day in, day out, the same cereal.
Yeah.
So there's a really good example, isn't there, of that, you know, if I can't filter this out, I'm just going to make it so much easier. I'm just going to have the same thing every morning. And then I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about it. I can just eat.
Absolutely. It's one less thing to take attention away from. And that's how it's almost seen, like that it's painful. At times it can be totally distressing to have that attention taken away from where it wants to be. So, you know, it could even be from moving from one activity prior to the meal, like maybe they're watching telly, to then, you know, being told it's dinner time, to then shifting that attention. Okay, telly has to go off. You know, there might well be ructions at that point. And then real reluctance to join, you know, to change from one room to another, to change position. And that comes into the umbrella of autistic inertia. Something else I focused on, which is consistent with monotropism, in that it's about disengaging from the environment, the sensory environment, because it's all too much, perhaps. And it could get confused with freeze, you know, the sort of stress response of freeze, and that, you know, the young person might at that point go mute. They might well completely withdraw or curl up, you know, show in their body that they're wanting to hide and shrink. You know, that there could be autistic inertia at play here. And as well as sticky attention, I love that, you know, sticky attention, where, you know, it's a bit like Velcro. You've got two pieces of Velcro and you have to give it a real tug to get it apart. It's the same with attention in an autistic brain, and that, you know, it requires that huge amount of effort to stop doing one thing and move on to another. And that can happen within a meal as well. That, you know, it's been pretty common knowledge for me in my research over the years, that there's a lot of autistic children that don't like their food touching on a plate, for example. Or they might eat, if there's a meal of different ingredients, they might eat in a particular order because they can't contaminate, they can't merge, no sauces, you know, things like that, which make it easier for the autistic brain to focus at one thing at one time. So eating all the meat before eating the vegetables and so
Yeah.
on.
I was just thinking about as well, although I think some of this relates to young people who have hypermobility, but one of the questions that I always ask is about the manipulation of cutlery. And quite often, if they've got difficulties with handwriting and holding a pen, they've got difficulty with spreading and cutting with a knife. But I'm wondering now as well as to whether there is difficulty, not because of those identified with hypermobility, but those who aren't identified with hypermobility, whether the issue around the cutlery is because knives scratch. So it could be the noise, couldn't it, that really puts you off with that. So would you then say, I would prefer only finger food where there's no cutlery involved? But there's also, you know, I hear quite often as well, thinking about siblings who breathe over their food and the food has to be binned, or they cough near the food and the food has to be binned, or the sandwich has to have the edges cut off. And if a child is particularly anxious, if it's not done symmetrically correct, that will be binned. So already there's quite a few sensory difficulties in that, isn't there?
Absolutely. And to me, that is the autistic brain at play, and that you know, it is about that singular focus and trying to channel attention, because they know that they should be eating, for example. You know, there is that pressure, there is that demand.
Yeah.
Again, that could be something else influencing, and that, you know, there might be extreme demand avoidance at play. And so a young person might well get very distressed because of the demand to eat, and you know, certainly being together at the meal table and seeing others around you eating, tucking into the meal, and then suddenly you can't eat. You know, it's not can't, it's not won't, it's can't.
Yeah.
You can't eat, and therefore the incredible pressure building up of anxiety, because this is what's expected, is that we behave ourselves at the table, we sit and eat quietly, we also have to share our, you know, day, you know, what's happened today, and let's talk about that. And then of course you've got auditory at play, you've got you know, the cognition at play, because you're trying to understand conversations. You're thinking, okay, I've been asked this question, how was my day? Oh, I've got to focus on that now, so therefore I can't eat because I've got to you know, think about that. And so that's why a young person taking an awful long time to eat, for example, might be a sign that, you know, they're really struggling with their anxiety. And of course we know with the PDA profile that anxiety is absolutely key. I mean, I found a young man online called the Autistic Scholar. I've got a quote to read. He said, I admitted when I was young that anxiety and fear can play a major role in my eating and the negative opinion around sensory experiences associated with food. The anxiety and fear don't come from nowhere. And even before anxiety and fear are amplified and amplifying the negative sensory experience, it was still clearly negative enough for me to start evoking anxiety reactions. So it is that whole, you know, build-up of anxiety around food. You know, yeah, it just sort of feeds itself, doesn't it? Pardon the pun.
Yes, and you know, I referred earlier to my youngest daughter around vomiting, that real fear around vomiting, and I don't know how it came about, but it was only last week that she was talking about how she'd had a time gap of 8 years of not vomiting. She's really proud of that, but the level of food avoidance that goes alongside it, you know, is intense. But there's also quite a few of my clients who have complained that food sticks at the back of their throat, and so they physically cannot swallow. It feels very dry and they cannot get that food to swallow. And then, of course, you're thinking about there's a lot of autistic young people who bitterly complain they cannot take medication because, again, it's that not wishing to gag, but also for those who cannot swallow, they find it really difficult. And if you think about young people with ADHD who take melatonin, or there's a lot of anemic autistic individuals, and they again have to take it, or iron supplements is another big one. You know, that horrible taste, that real fear and anxiety around gagging or vomiting or just simply not being able to swallow must be really tricky, mustn't it? I mean, it's just horrible, that idea, isn't it?
Well, certainly some of our parents have shared that in the poll, you know, that there has been the difficulty to swallow food. I mean, 11 parents put that they, you know, they might feel unable to swallow food. And that is a very real physical, somatic, biological cause and response. You know, it doesn't happen for nothing. And if you're reporting as a parent to school, for example, or to a GP, this happens a lot. You know, that my child is gagging, choking, retching, being sick. That, you know, they want evidence of that, and that it's not enough to just report that. Sadly, you know, there's this fabricated illness element, certainly around vomiting, that if you say, you know, your child is regularly vomiting, it's not necessarily believed, which is a whole other ball game. But it certainly adds to the stress of the parent and the influence of that stress on the young person. And, you know, I know myself that when I'm stressed and when I'm anxious, this part of me, my throat, it's a very sensitive area for a lot of people. And I have at times in the past been unable to eat because of my anxiety. I'm likely to go that way, to not eat at all if I'm more anxious than normal.
Yeah. So the next part of the program, we wanted to obviously be nosy, really, didn't we, about, you know, what's the clientele? What's the real, genuine reality of the presentations in our mental health assessments and screening? And interestingly, there is only a handful of young people who've come through with a formal diagnosis of this. But there are clearly indicators which suggest for other young people that, you know, potentially they could go further in being screened and diagnosed for this, which is quite interesting. But anyway, we actually have 5 clients that we could look and draw upon resources. And we were talking about this before the program. And there was some really interesting developments, wasn't there? So we were kind of just like, well, that's really quite interesting. So one is we looked at the RCADs, of course, because I love looking at the RCADs. They're very, very interesting in the presentations of the top 3. And invariably, there's social phobia, there is separation anxiety and major depression. But just occasionally, out of the 2 out of the 5 had a presentation of panic disorder. So that's quite interesting. But we also then started to look at what else they showed in their presentations, and all of them had a PDA profile or emerging traits where it was just under the threshold. That's very interesting. All of them were non-school attenders. That's very interesting. But we also then found that out of the 5 of them, 3 of them actually had light sensory or a formal diagnosis of Erlen's. So this is really interesting, because when we're looking at all the senses around food, of course, it comes straight back to the appearance, does it not? And all of them had issues around noise and smell. So I really thought that was quite an interesting, I know it's a tiny number in the number of young people that I've screened, but 5 all looking relatively similar in their presentations can't just be by chance, can it? There's something really interesting about that.
I remember you saying as well about a commonality being mutism.
Yes, yeah.
That situational mutism, that that there's no surprise to me about the PDA element. There is surprise about the mutism, but then when you think about it, if you think of the body holistically and in a slightly alternative left of field way, you think about the ancient medicines and the chakras, that our mouth is part of our head, same as our eyes, all of our key sites of interest in regards our senses is around our head and our chakras at these points. And so being unable to take in too much visual information, which presumably comes along with Erland's diagnosis, as well as the sensitivity to light, that is perhaps again like this overload of information visually coming to play. Have you frozen? Oh, we've got signal issues. I'll carry on. Also, that there are types of sensory people or dispositions. And what I found really interesting in a book that I've got called Living, all of us, whether we're neurodivergent or not, have styles of sensing. And so there are 4 categories. There is the seeker, who will look out for novel experiences, new experiences, intense experiences, might well be really excited to try new meals, for example, and change it up. There are the avoiders, who like sameness and routine and planning meals ahead. There are the sensors amongst us, who are very detail aware, who like comfort and maybe orientated around comfort in terms of the whole meal experience being a comfortable experience. And then there are the bystanders, who are easygoing, might let things pass them by, might miss information, and a positive of that is that they are flexible. So the avoiders among us, of which this is clearly a link to the restrictive, avoidant food intake, they will want to control the amount of sensory information that they receive, and they might well seek to eat their meals on their own. They will shy away from the dinner table, the meal time with the family. Certainly the avoider I know, he likes to sit with his headphones on, attached to his device, perched on his tray, completely focused on his device while eating his meal. And if I interrupt, or if there's any sort of interruption, then that can be very distressing and disturbing in the extreme, that he, once he started his meal, he has to finish it without sort of distraction. So avoiders can experience discomfort very, very easily. And I think that is certainly indicative of looking at the clients and people talking about anxiety, that anxiety can be very quickly heightened in the family meal situation. And social phobia, of course, is hand in hand with the social expectation of talking and being with people while eating. And I think that's all very common. And I know from I'm just wondering what's gone wrong with Lavinia. Apologies, everybody. We seem to have had a social media difficulty or a signal issue. I will move on, even though the banner hasn't moved on, because we are running out of time. And I think we're still live. Yes, I can see the clock. So forgive us, everybody. Bear with us. We seem to have a technical problem. Going on to the parents' experience of this, and obviously we here at the M Word are painfully aware of how difficult having these distressing experiences around food are for the family, and managing that is incredibly challenging. And I wanted to highlight the need to reframe our thinking around it as being so restrictive that, you know, these children of ours are fussy eaters or picky eaters. And that has the negative connotation, of course, of, you know, they have made this choice deliberately to be awkward, or that they're badly behaved at meal times. And this is far from my understanding of the situation. And I want to acknowledge and help validate, you know, the challenges parents face in dealing with such daily difficulties around food. I had a quote from the autistic scholar who is now an adult, who can report, "My parents eventually came to the understanding that being simple is crucial, and that they recognized my disgust with certain foods was not fussing, was not exaggerating. I would go to any and all lengths, and if necessary, by not eating, in order to avoid food that was aversive to me. It would have been far simpler for me to just eat all the foods, but I just could not do it, not without significant distress or nausea. What possible motive could I have for faking or exaggerating this reaction to food? If I could, I would have derived enjoyment from my food the way others could." He goes on to say about family dinners, and this is part of what I was thinking of as a switch in perception, is to think that the social ritual of the family meal does not have to be standard if it causes a problem. He goes on to say, "I've complained before that neurotypical people are annoyingly inflexible at times, and the ritual of the family dinner is a neurotypical concept. And this definitely is one of these reasons why it creates stubborn, irritating inflexibility." So you could do it differently. You could think, okay, if I'm to have a healthy child eating food with regularity, then perhaps I need to look at how I could do it differently. And then the young person might well start to recognize that it isn't all about the anxiety, that it is about thinking of healthiness and having that decent amount of nutrition, which we all come to realize in adulthood, of course. I mean, when our young people are really young, you know, the last thing they think about is the nutritional value of what they're actually putting in their mouths. It's more about the taste and if it's exciting enough or interesting enough for them to finish it off. So it is a question of listening, I think, more often than not, to how your young person perceives the sensory experience of eating. if they make a comment such as, you know, oh, I don't like it that those foods are touching, or I don't give me gravy, I absolutely do not want gravy. If you're out at a restaurant and they struggle to eat any of the meals on offer and do not want to eat any of them, then to think, okay, why is that? And perhaps it's okay that you don't eat anything and you can have a drink instead, and maybe eat what you want when you get home. There are so many questions around how we can perceive sensory difficulties around food. And one of the main focuses of our attention as parents and professionals has to be on what is the root cause of this. It could be a combination of factors. What is the history? Were there signs of difficulties when they were little? Were there signs of any distress with meals? I've just had a message from Lavinia. The connection has gone down. Okay. Oh, she's back. Oh my goodness.
I'm so sorry.
What can I do? What can I do? Because I can't even
people
stop
know
the
what
live.
was happening there. So BT is currently outside our studio and decided to interrupt our connection. But well done to Sue for keep going.
Oh my goodness, that was so difficult, wasn't it?
Oh, bless you. So how far have you got up to? Because we're nearly running out of time, aren't we? Where are you now? Were you thinking about?
Yeah, I was talking about how to reframe and to focus on ways of.
I'll be this one then.
Yeah. Well, no, I've done that one.
You've done that one now.
I have to. It's okay. We'll carry on. I mean,
we'll carry on.
I think what I just wanted to get across was that, you know, these anomalies, these sometimes bizarre requests that, you know, if they're bizarre to us, they're certainly not bizarre to our young person. And that it's a case of, you know, we all have our own individual perceptions. And if we are a sensory seeker ourselves as a parent, like I am, you know, I love my food and I'm always looking for new and exciting ways of doing meals and looking up recipes. And, you know, that's me. But that's very different to my child. And although that might cause challenges in terms of my food planning, you know, my meal planning for the week, it is not impossible that I can adapt and adjust and compromise. And I think compromises are necessary in order to have some sort of status quo around eating. I mean, I've certainly compromised a lot in my past with both of my children. And, you know, it doesn't have to be stressful. It can be thinking of, you know, okay, if there's one pot and it's a stew type thing or spaghetti bolognese, for example, and if there's one person who doesn't want a particular ingredient in that spaghetti bolognese, then it could be removed by yourself before you present it. There are so many different avenues to pursue. And the main one I want people to hold on to is that, you know, we hear you, we understand these challenges are very real for many families. And there is always hope, and to be a detective, to be a sensory detective, not just for your children, but for yourselves, and to think, okay, what is it that I seek or avoid? And to just think about it a little bit and be curious about it. And hopefully with a bit more understanding, there can be some general content around food.
Nice. I'm so sorry to so many of you where I suddenly disappeared, but Sue, you have been such a trooper. You just carried on, apparently. John was watching.
I didn't know what to do. But yeah, these things are sent to try us, aren't
They
they?
are so sent to try us.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much to so many of you who decided to take part in the poll to help us with the programme today, because obviously that was really helpful for Sue to kind of give her direction as to what she needed to look into. My thanks again, Sue. You have been such a trooper, and I'm so grateful. We will see you next week, next Wednesday, 12:15. Catch us here live. Bye now.
Bye.